Black waitress feeds rich man's disabled daughter. What happens next will melt your heart. Subscribe for more stories. A gentle chime sounded as Malcolm Brooks entered the small diner, the comforting aroma of fresh bread and brewing coffee enveloping him. He rarely visited establishments like this, his life of corporate meetings dictating a preference for upscale restaurants with starched linens. But this evening was not about business. It was about his daughter. Amara, his 6-year-old, was beside him in her custom wheelchair. Her small frame was bundled in a soft pink coat, her head tilted slightly, and her fingers traced invisible patterns on the fabric of her dress. She was silent, not taking in her surroundings like other children. She was simply there. A familiar ache tightened in Malcolm's chest. The hostess, a young woman with tired eyes, managed a faint smile as she grabbed 2 menus. "A table for 2, somewhere quiet," Malcolm requested, his voice low and resonant. She led them to a secluded booth, away from the clatter of the main dining area. As Malcolm settled across from Amara, he picked up the menu but barely registered the words. His gaze was fixed on his daughter. "Amara," he murmured, "are you hungry?" She offered no reply. She never did. Malcolm exhaled slowly, hating this powerlessness that squeezed his heart whenever he tried to connect with her. He had spent a fortune building an empire, making ruthless decisions and orchestrating billion-dollar deals. Yet with his own child, he felt utterly defeated. A waitress approached their table, a small notepad in her hand. "Good evening. My name is Zuri, and I'll be your server tonight." Malcolm looked up. She was young, likely in her mid-20s, with warm, deep brown eyes that held a light he didn't often see in service staff. A dusting of flour on her apron suggested she'd just been in the kitchen. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice gentle. Malcolm cleared his throat. "I'll have the grilled chicken. And for my daughter, something soft. The soup, perhaps." Zuri glanced at Amara, a flicker of understanding in her expression. "Our chicken noodle is homemade. Would that be all right for her?" Malcolm hesitated, then nodded. "That's fine, excellent. I'll be right back." As Zuri departed, Malcolm pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails while his mind raced. Would Amara eat? Would she reject the spoon, as she always did? A short while later, Zuri returned, placing a steaming bowl of soup before Amara and the plate of chicken in front of Malcolm. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said before moving away. Malcolm sighed and picked up the spoon. "Okay, sweetie, let's give this a try." He scooped up a small amount of soup and brought it toward Amara's lips. Before it could reach her, her hand shot out, knocking it away. The spoon clattered against the plate, splattering broth on the white tablecloth. A few patrons glanced over. Malcolm's jaw clenched. A hot surge of frustration rose in him, not at her, but at the situation, at his own inadequacy. He retrieved the spoon, his voice softer this time. "Amara, please, nothing." She just sat there, her tiny fingers clutching the hem of her dress, lost in a world he couldn't enter. He breathed out, rubbing a hand over his face, so consumed by his own frustration that he almost missed the figure beside him. "May I?" It was Zuri. She was crouched by Amara, her expression unreadable. Malcolm was perplexed. "What?" "May I try?" she asked again, gesturing to the spoon. He paused. His instinct was to refuse. Amara wasn't a charity case. He'd hired the best therapists and specialists, none of whom had broken through her walls. But something in Zuri's steady, compassionate gaze gave him pause. Wordlessly, he handed her the spoon. Zuri shifted to be at eye level with the little girl. She didn't immediately try to feed her. Instead, she spoke in a soft, melodic tone. "Hello, Amara," she said, as if greeting a friend. Amara didn't respond, but Zuri continued. "You know," she mused, dipping the spoon in the broth, "my mother used to say that soup is like a warm hug for your tummy." She raised the spoon slightly, but made no move to force it. "Would you like to try a little hug?" Malcolm watched, stunned. No one had ever spoken to Amara like that, as if she was not just present but listening and understanding. For a second, nothing happened. Then, Amara's fingers twitched. Malcolm held his breath. Zuri smiled warmly. "Just one tiny taste, sweet girl." Slowly, patiently, she guided the spoon to Amara's lips. This time, Amara didn't flinch. The warm soup touched her mouth, and after a moment's hesitation, she swallowed. Malcolm stared. It was just a spoonful, a single taste, but for a child who resisted every meal, it was a miracle. Then the truly impossible occurred. Amara looked at Zuri, not through her or past her, but directly at her, and she smiled. A small, gentle curve of her lips. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for Malcolm. Amara hadn't smiled in years, not since her mother's passing. He was unmoored. The restaurant, the other diners, the ambient noise, it all faded away. There was only Amara and this woman who had reached her in a way no one else could. His voice came out as a rasp. "How did you do that?" Zuri looked up at him, her warm brown eyes holding a depth he couldn't quite fathom. "I just talked to her," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Malcolm had no response. He just sat there, staring at the woman who had shattered all his assumptions about his daughter. And for the first time in a very long time, Malcolm Brooks felt a flicker of something he'd thought was long dead. Hope. Malcolm didn't sleep that night. Long after he had taken Amara home, tucked her into bed, and retreated to his study, the image of Zuri kneeling beside his daughter replayed in his mind. The way she had spoken to Amara, the girl's response, and that smile. That smile hadn't graced Amara's face since his wife died. He sat at his polished mahogany desk, staring unseeingly at the amber liquid in his glass. He had employed experts and specialists, yet none had connected with her like Zuri, a waitress in a neighborhood diner. Who was she? He picked up his phone and, after a moment's hesitation, dialed his assistant. "I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Zuri Lane," he commanded. The following evening, Malcolm returned to the restaurant. It was quieter now, the dinner rush having subsided. He saw Zuri clearing a table, the sleeves of her uniform pushed up, her dark coils pulled back from her face. She worked with an efficient grace that spoke of long practice. Malcolm strode directly toward her. She looked up, startled by his approach. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "We need to talk," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She wiped her hands on her apron, glancing at the few remaining customers. "I'm working. This won't take long," Zuri sighed, then gestured for him to follow her to the service area, away from prying eyes. Malcolm wasted no time. "You were incredible with Amara last night." Zuri blinked, clearly not expecting the compliment. She shrugged. "I saw a child. Not a condition, precisely a tense silence stretched between them. Malcolm studied her, searching for something she was holding back. "You've worked with children like her before, haven't you?" he asked. Zuri tensed. I used to babysit. That's all." Malcolm narrowed his eyes. "You're not being honest." Zuri's lips thinned. "Look, I don't know what you're getting at, but I did some research." Malcolm cut in, his voice steady but firm. "You were a special needs education major at NYU. Top of your class." Zuri's breath hitched. "Then, 2 years ago, you dropped out." Malcolm continued, watching her reaction. "No explanation, no forwarding information. And now you're waiting tables." Zuri's hands balled into fists at her sides. "I don't see how that's any of your business," she said quietly. Malcolm stepped closer. "It's my business when you're the only person who has ever made my daughter smile." Zuri flinched, a barely perceptible retreat, but Malcolm saw it. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Malcolm exhaled. "Come work for me." Zuri's head snapped up. "What?" "Be Amara's caregiver," Malcolm said. "She trusts you. She responds to you." His voice softened. "She needs you." Zuri stared at him, her expression hardening. Then she let out a short, mirthless laugh. "You don't even know me," she said, shaking her head. "And you think hiring me is a sound decision?" "I know enough," Malcolm replied. "I know you're brilliant, you're compassionate, and I know that whatever reason you had for abandoning your old life, it wasn't for a lack of talent." Zuri drew a sharp breath, her gaze finally breaking away. Malcolm saw it then, a flicker of deep, hidden pain in her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. Malcolm was baffled. "Zuri, I can't," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Brooks, but I'm not the person you think I am." Malcolm was silent for a long moment. "Tell me why," he finally asked. Zuri hesitated, her throat working as if holding back a torrent of emotion. Then she shook her head. "No, I have tables to bus." And with that, she turned and walked away. Malcolm watched her go, his jaw tight. Whatever had made Zuri Lane flee the career she was born for, it was still haunting her. And for the first time in years, Malcolm felt a compulsion to understand why. Malcolm Brooks was not a man who accepted defeat. When a problem presented itself, he analyzed it. When a door was closed to him, he found the key. And Zuri Lane was a puzzle he refused to ignore. After their last conversation, he couldn't shake the image of her eyes, the way she had recoiled, the slight tremor in her voice before she fled. She was more than just a waitress with a gift for children. She was running from something, and Malcolm was determined to find out what. It didn't take him long. With his resources, uncovering Zuri's past was a simple matter. She had been a star pupil at NYU, specializing in pediatric special needs education and therapy. Professors had described her as brilliant, intuitive, one of the most promising students they had ever encountered. Then, 2 years ago, she had vanished. No degree, no graduation. She simply disappeared. Malcolm frowned as he scanned the reports. Why would someone so gifted walk away from their calling? Then he found the answer. A brief obituary notice. The smiling face of a young boy with bright, intelligent eyes. Micah Lane, age 10. A cold knot formed in Malcolm's stomach. The notice was terse, sparing with details, only stating that the boy's death had been sudden. But it was enough. Zuri Lane hadn't just studied special needs. She had lived it, and she had suffered an unimaginable loss. That evening, Malcolm returned to the restaurant. He didn't take a table. He didn't order. He just waited. When Zuri finally spotted him standing by the entrance, she sighed, rubbing a hand across her weary face. "Mr. Brooks, you're becoming a regular. We need to talk," Malcolm said, his tone brooking no argument. Zuri crossed her arms over her chest. "I thought we already had—" "Not about this." Something in his voice made her pause. He nodded toward the door. "Let's step outside." Zuri's lips formed a tight line, but after a moment, she untied her apron and followed him out. The night air was cool, the street quiet save for the occasional passing car. Malcolm turned to face her. "I know about Micah." Zuri froze. The breath left her body, and for a split second, she looked as if she'd been physically struck. A pang of regret hit Malcolm's chest, but he pressed on. "I know he was your brother. I know he had cerebral palsy. And I know he don't," Zuri whispered, her voice barely audible. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" Zuri let out a hollow, broken laugh. "Because it's none of your business. That's why." Malcolm took a step closer. "You abandoned your life's work. I need to understand why. So you can fix me? Offer me another job I don't want. I need to know because you're the only person who has ever gotten through to my daughter," Malcolm retorted. "And if you're not going to help her, I at least deserve to know the reason." Zuri shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold the pieces together. "Micah was my everything," she finally said, her voice hollow. "My parents were hardly around. It was always just me and him. I built my entire life around learning how to care for him. I promised him I'd always be there, that I would make things better for him." She took a ragged breath. "And I failed." The words shattered in the cool air. "One night, he got sick," she continued, her voice cracking. "It was just a fever at first, but it got worse so fast. By the time we got him to the hospital," her voice trailed off. "It was too late." Malcolm swallowed hard. Zuri swiped angrily at her eyes. "I was studying how to help kids like him. I was supposed to know what to do, but I didn't. I let him down." She looked up at Malcolm then, her eyes shimmering with raw pain. "And I will not fail another child." Malcolm stared at her, his own heart aching. This was why she'd refused him. Not out of indifference, but because she cared too much. Because the loss of one child had broken her, and she was terrified of getting close to another. Zuri shook her head, backing away. "So now you know. Are you happy?" Malcolm didn't answer. For the first time in his life, he was completely at a loss for words. Zuri hadn't intended to say yes when Malcolm asked again. 1 week. Just give it a try for 7 days. She had been fully prepared to refuse, but something in his voice, a quiet desperation behind his usual commanding tone, made her hesitate. And then there was Amara. Zuri could still picture the little girl's faint smile in the restaurant, the way her dark eyes had focused on her, the way she had responded to a simple act of kindness. It had been so long since Zuri had felt competent at anything, so long since she had felt needed. So, against every instinct screaming at her to run, she agreed. 1 week. That's all. The Brooks residence was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress, a sleek, modern structure hidden behind imposing steel gates and meticulously manicured lawns. Zuri followed Malcolm inside, clutching her bag strap as she took in the soaring ceilings, gleaming marble floors, and vast, open spaces that felt more like a museum than a place to live. "This way," Malcolm said, leading her down a long corridor. They stopped at a partially open door. Amara's room. Zuri stepped inside and felt an immediate catch in her throat. The room was beautiful, decorated in soft, warm colors, with shelves of books and plush toys, and a floor-to-ceiling window that bathed everything in afternoon sunlight. And in the center of it all, curled in her wheelchair, was Amara. She didn't look up as they entered. Malcolm sighed, running a hand over the back of his neck. She's been even quieter since. Since her mother passed, Zuri glanced at him. His expression was a mask of composure, but the tension in his jaw told the real story. He blamed himself. She turned back to Amara, intimately familiar with that same feeling of guilt. The first 2 days were brutal. Amara acknowledged Zuri's presence only with resistance. She would pull her hand back when Zuri tried to guide it to a toy, and turn her head away when spoken to. Doubt began to coil in Zuri's stomach. What if she couldn't do this anymore? What if she failed Amara, just as she felt she'd failed Micah? But on the 3rd day, something shifted. Zuri had been reading aloud from a picture book, her voice soft and steady, even though Amara showed no signs of listening. Then, just as she was about to close the book, she saw it. Amara's fingers were tapping faintly against the armrest of her chair. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it was in perfect rhythm with Zuri's cadence. Zuri held her breath. "You like this story, don't you?" she asked gently. There was no verbal response, but the faint tapping continued, and for the first time, Zuri felt a sliver of hope. That evening, Zuri stood beside Amara's bed, smoothing the covers. The little girl's eyes were half closed, her breathing even. Zuri paused. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to sing. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Amara stirred slightly, but didn't pull away. "You make me happy when skies are gray." A lump formed in Zuri's throat. It was the lullaby she used to sing to Micah, the one he always requested, even on his worst days. She hadn't sung it since he died. She'd sworn she never would again. But now, watching Amara's small hand relax its grip on the edge of the blanket, she couldn't stop. Outside in the hall, Malcolm stood motionless. He had been passing by when he heard Zuri's voice. He had expected resistance from Amara. He had prepared himself for this 1-week trial to be a failure. But standing there, listening to that gentle, heartbreakingly beautiful melody, he witnessed something he hadn't seen in months. Amara was sleeping peacefully. No tossing, no whimpering, no nightmares that left her gasping for breath. Malcolm swallowed hard, gripping the doorframe. For the first time since his wife's death, his daughter was at peace, and it wasn't because of him. It was because of her. Malcolm Brooks had spent his life building an empire. He'd closed multi-billion-dollar deals, negotiated with the most ruthless titans of industry, and turned failing companies into powerhouses. But none of it, not a single victory, had ever felt as profound as watching his daughter begin to trust again. And it was all because of Zuri. The changes were small at first. Malcolm found himself lingering. Whenever Zuri was with Amara, he'd tell himself he was just observing, monitoring the progress of his week-long experiment. But then he started participating. It began with little things, helping Amara stack blocks, holding her hand during a therapy exercise, sitting nearby as Zuri read stories. Then, almost without realizing it, he was there every day. One afternoon, as Zuri guided Amara through a simple stretching routine, she glanced up to find Malcolm watching them. Not just watching, but truly seeing. There was a softness in his expression, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "You don't have to stay, you know," Zuri said quietly. Malcolm didn't take his eyes off Amara, who was gripping his fingers tightly as she worked on her balance. "Yes, I do." Zuri looked at him confused. "Why?" Malcolm let out a long breath, his gaze still fixed on his daughter. "Because I should have been here all along." Something in Zuri's chest loosened. She had initially dismissed Malcolm as just another wealthy executive, too preoccupied with his career to raise his own child. But now, really looking at him, she saw the truth. He wasn't absent because he didn't care. He was absent because he didn't know how to be present. The more time Malcolm spent with them, the more Zuri watched him transform. He started to laugh more, not the controlled, polite chuckle she'd heard before, but a genuine, deep-bellied laugh. He learned Amara's cues, her signs of distress and her moments of joy. He learned how to simply be there. And Zuri felt a sense of purpose she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She had spent so long convinced she wasn't cut out for this anymore, that she would only cause more pain if she tried. But with Amara, it didn't feel like a job. It felt like coming home. One evening, after a particularly good day, Zuri and Malcolm sat on the back patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Amara was already asleep inside, exhausted but happy. Zuri sipped her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her. "She's doing so well." Malcolm nodded, his gaze distant. "Because of you." Zuri shook her head. "Because of her. I'm just helping her find her own strength." Malcolm turned to her then, his dark eyes intense. "You do that for people, don't you?" Zuri blinked. "What?" "You make them believe they're capable of more than they thought." His voice was low, but it held an undertone, something Zuri wasn't ready to name. She looked away. "I used to think so." Malcolm watched her for a long moment, then said, almost too gently, "You still do." Zuri's heart skipped a beat. For the first time since meeting him, she saw Malcolm Brooks not as a billionaire, not as a distant father, but as a man. And that terrified her. It happened in an instant. One moment they were sitting in the twilight, the air thick with unspoken words. The next, Malcolm had taken her hand. She didn't pull away. His thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, a soft, questioning touch. "Zuri," he murmured. She looked up, and he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't rushed or demanding. It was slow, tender, as if giving her every opportunity to stop him. But she didn't. For one brief, stolen moment, she let herself feel the warmth of his lips, the way his hand cupped her cheek, the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. And then reality crashed down. Zuri pulled back abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. Malcolm's brow furrowed in confusion. "Zuri, I can't," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. Malcolm reached for her, but she took a step back. I'm sorry," she stammered, shaking her head. "No, I shouldn't have. That was wrong." His expression hardened. "Wrong." Zuri swallowed hard. "I can't do this, Malcolm." He stood then, a flicker of anger in his eyes. "Why not?" "Because I can't." Her voice cracked. She took a breath, gripping the railing behind her. "I can't lose someone I care about again." Malcolm's face softened. "Zuri," but she was already turning, hurrying back inside, leaving Malcolm standing alone in the fading light, his heart pounding. And for the first time in years, he realized just how much he didn't want to be alone anymore. Zuri had spent years building fortresses around her heart, telling herself that distance was safety, that caring too deeply only led to pain. But somehow, without her even realizing it, Malcolm and Amara had slipped through the cracks. And that was the most frightening thing of all. She made her decision the next morning. She walked into Malcolm's office, heart hammering against her ribs, her hands balled into tight fists. He looked up from his desk, surprised. "Zuri," she swallowed hard. "I'm resigning." The words felt like shards of glass in her throat, but she forced them out. Malcolm's expression shuddered. He leaned back his chair, folding his arms across his broad chest. "Say that again." Zuri kept her voice steady. "I can't do this anymore." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Why?" Because I care too much. Because I'm terrified. Because I don't know how I'd survive losing you. but she couldn't say any of that. Instead, she offered a small shrug. This was always a temporary arrangement. I never intended to stay permanently. Malcolm's eyes were unreadable. Is that it? You're just leaving? Zuri nodded, even as a wave of nausea rolled through her. Yes. Malcolm let out a sharp, disbelieving breath, shaking his head. And Amara? Zuri flinched. She'll be fine. No, she won't. His voice was low-taut. You know she won't. Zuri bit her lip, looking away. She couldn't afford to think about Amara, about how the little girl had started to open up, to trust, about how her small fingers had clung to Zuri's shirt just the night before. If she thought about it, she would break. So she forced herself to meet Malcolm's gaze and deliver the cruelest blow she could muster. She doesn't need me. She needs a mother. Someone who can be there for the long haul. Malcolm's face went rigid. You're looking for a replacement, she went on, ignoring the part of her heart that was screaming for her to stop. But I was never going to be a permanent solution. You're just looking for someone to. She paused, then delivered the final, devastating strike. To replace your wife. The silence that followed was deafening. Malcolm's entire body went still, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Get out. Zuri's throat burned. Malcolm, get out. Now, Zuri turned and walked away, each step feeling like it was tearing her apart. Amara stopped eating 3 days after Zuri left. She stopped playing. She stopped responding. She stopped smiling. Malcolm tried. God, he tried. He sat with her for every meal, read her favorite stories, played the games Zuri had taught them, but it was hollow. Amara didn't look at him the way she had looked at Zuri. Her face didn't light up with the same joy. And Malcolm hated it. He hated that he wasn't enough. He hated that Zuri had walked away as if they had meant nothing. But most of all, he hated how much he missed her. Malcolm Brooks had always been a man of logic. He built his empire on cold, calculated risks, never letting emotion compromise his judgment. But now, logic failed him because no amount of reasoning could fix the gaping hole Zuri had left behind. And worse, he wasn't the only one suffering. Amara was disappearing before his eyes. It started subtly, refusing her favorite meals, turning away when he tried to help her with simple tasks, no longer reaching for his hand. Then one night he passed her room and heard it, a small, muffled sound. He pushed the door open to see her curled into a tight ball, crying silently into her pillow. Something inside him shattered. Malcolm sat on the edge of her bed, his chest aching. Amara, she didn't respond. He reached out, brushing the hair from her tear-streaked face. Talk to me, sweetie, Amara sniffled. Then, in a voice so quiet it almost broke him, she whispered, Where's Zuri? Malcolm closed his eyes. He'd spent weeks telling himself he could fix this, that with enough effort, Amara would bounce back. But he had been a fool, because Zuri hadn't just been a temporary caregiver. She had become family, and Malcolm had been too proud, too stubborn, too afraid to admit how much she meant to both of them. Not anymore. The diner was bustling when Malcolm walked in, but he didn't care. He wasn't there for the crowd, or the food, or for anything but her. And this time, he wasn't alone. Amara was nestled in his arms, her small hands clutching his jacket, her face pale from weeks of sadness. Zuri was behind the counter, scribbling on an order pad. She looked tired, thinner than he remembered, her beautiful coils pulled back haphazardly. But when she looked up and saw them, she froze. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Zuri's gaze fell on Amara, and her breath caught. She was around the counter in a flash, kneeling beside them, her hands trembling as she reached for the little girl. Amara, her voice broke. Oh, sweet girl. Amara lifted her head, looking at Zuri as if she wasn't sure she was real. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted a small hand and touched Zuri's cheek. The moment she felt that familiar, gentle touch, Zuri's composure crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she gathered Amara into her arms, hugging her as if she would never let go. Malcolm watched, his own throat tight. Then, quietly, he said the words he should have said weeks ago. I need you, Zuri. Zuri went still, her arms tightening around Amara as she looked up at him, her dark eyes swimming with unshed tears. Malcolm took a step closer. "I don't just need you for Amara," he continued, his voice raw with vulnerability. "I need you for me." Zuri's lips parted, but no words came out. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to, but the fear was still there. Amara's small fingers wrapped around the spoon, her hand shaking slightly as she guided it toward her own mouth. The dining room was silent, every breath held in anticipation. Then, for the first time in her life, she fed herself a bite. A small, uncertain motion. But to Malcolm and Zuri, it was everything. Amara blinked in surprise, then looked up at Zuri, her eyes wide. Zuri's throat felt thick with emotion. "You did it, sweet girl." Malcolm let out a slow breath, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "You really did it." Amara let out a small giggle, a sound Malcolm hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. And in that moment, he knew this wasn't just about what Zuri had done for Amara. It was about what she had done for him. For the first time since his wife's death, he wasn't afraid to love again. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around the small velvet box he'd been carrying for days. Zuri turned to him, still dabbing at her happy tears. "What?" Malcolm took a deep breath. Then, before she could say another word, he dropped to one knee. "Zuri," he began, his voice soft. "Marry me." Zuri's breath hitched. Her hands flew to her mouth. Amara, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, clapped her hands together. "Zuri, say yes." Zuri let out a tearful laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "Malcolm." He took her hand, his grip firm and sure. "I love you," he said simply. "And I don't just want you in Amara's life. I want you in mine." Zuri's eyes filled with tears again. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was something else, something new, something that felt like certainty. She let out a shaky breath and whispered, "Yes." Malcolm slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as Amara cheered beside them. For the first time in a long time, they weren't three broken people navigating survival. They were a family. Love isn't just about finding the right person. It's about choosing them over and over again. Malcolm had spent years believing love was a chapter of his life that was permanently closed. Zuri had spent just as long telling herself that love was a risk too painful to take. But in the end, it wasn't about the fear. It was about the sound of Amara's laughter filling their home. It was about Malcolm finding the courage to open his heart again. It was about Zuri learning that she was not destined to lose everyone she cared for. Because real love, true love, isn't just about affection. It's about choosing faith and finding your family in the most unexpected of places. If this story touched your heart, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more moving tales that celebrate the power of love, resilience, and second chances. Because sometimes the family you find is even stronger than the one you were born into.